Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a narrow canyon in southern Colorado and to a young man who walked out of a ranch house on a warm July afternoon, said he would be back in an hour, and was never seen alive again. His name was Joe Keller. He was 18 years old, a competitive runner, a swim coach, a mathematics student who wanted to spend his life teaching high school algebra, and he vanished on the eve of his 19th birthday from a stretch of gravel road that his own family had driven 1,000 times. He was wearing red running shorts, blue trail shoes, and a watch. He left his phone behind. For almost a year, in a search that involved dogs and helicopters and infrared cameras and 200 volunteers, nobody found a single trace of him. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure, no guilt, and thank you so much to everyone who suggested this case. Truly, we're also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you want to listen there too. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable. This is a long one, and Joe's story deserves to be heard carefully. He was the kind of kid who volunteered most Saturdays at the Salvation Army and had already registered for his second year of college. His father remembers the last thing he said to him before the boys pulled out of the driveway, which was to have fun and be safe, and that he would see him when he got home. Let's step back for a moment. How does a young, strong, experienced runner disappear from a road he could not have gotten seriously lost on in daylight, within earshot of a working ranch? What did the search miss? And why did it take a stranger with no official standing to find what hundreds of trained people could not? And why, almost a decade later, does the mother of that young man still say that the official answer does not fit what she knows about her son? To understand this, we need to know who Joe Keller was. Cleveland, Tennessee sits in the southeastern corner of the state, tucked up against the foothills where the Appalachians start to gather themselves before running north. It is a city of about 40,000 people, the seat of Bradley County, close enough to Chattanooga that people commute, far enough that it still feels like its own place. There are churches on a great many corners. There are high school football fields that fill up on Friday nights. There is a rhythm to a town like that, an assumption that people know each other, that the boy who bags your groceries is somebody's son, and that you probably know whose. Joseph Lloyd Keller was born there on the 24th of July, 1996, to Neil and Zoe Keller. He had a younger sister named Hannah. The family lived on land outside town, and Joe grew up the way a lot of kids in Bradley County grow up, which is to say, outdoors and busy, and with a set of chores that did not care what the weather was doing. His mother's story is a little less typical for that part of Tennessee. Zoe and her sister Jane were originally from Kenya. Their family were British expatriates who left the country in the 1970s, and the two sisters ended up on different continents, living very different versions of an American life. One in the humid green of eastern Tennessee, one in the high, thin air of the Colorado San Juans. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it is the reason Joe had somewhere to go that summer. It is the reason a kid from Tennessee had an aunt and an uncle running a guest ranch 9,000 feet up in the mountains, and a standing invitation to come see it. You are in Cleveland, Tennessee, in the early 2000s. It is humid in the way that only the southeast is humid, a wet, heavy warmth that settles on you the second you step outside. There's a small boy with white blonde hair running flat out across a yard that has not been mowed in a week, and he has asthma, and he is running anyway, because being told he might not be able to do something has never once landed with him as a reason not to try it. His inhaler is somewhere in the house. He is not thinking about it. Joe had asthma as a 3-year-old. He had it badly enough that his family remembers it clearly, and by the time he was 12, he had essentially outgrown it. What replaced it was an appetite for endurance that is genuinely unusual even among athletic kids. He swam, he ran, he got into obstacle course racing, the kind of event where you drag yourself under barbed wire through a mud pit and then run another 3 miles. He was not built like a distance runner either. He was listed at around 5'7", compact and heavily muscled, more swimmer than marathoner, the kind of frame that makes a cross-country coach look twice and then put you in the water instead. At Bradley Central High School, he ran track and he swam, and he graduated in 2014. He was popular in the uncomplicated way that fit and cheerful and genuinely kind teenagers tend to be popular, which is to say he was well liked without ever seeming to work at it. Afterward, he enrolled at Cleveland State Community College, where he was studying mathematics. That was the plan. He wanted to be a high school math teacher, not a professor, not an engineer, not anything that would have taken him far from Bradley County. He wanted to stand in front of a room of 16-year-olds and explain quadratic equations to them, and he had picked the degree that would get him there. He also coached swimming. Think about what that means for a moment, because it is the sort of detail that gets lost in a case file. It means that on top of college coursework and his own training, Joe Keller spent hours standing on the wet tile of a pool deck teaching children who were frightened of the deep end how to put their faces in the water. It means he was patient. It means small kids liked him and their parents trusted him. And it means that on Saturdays, when a 19-year-old could reasonably be expected to be asleep until noon, he was more often than not down at the Salvation Army, doing whatever needed doing. Have you ever wondered what makes a missing persons case catch fire in a community the way this one did? Part of it is always circumstance, but part of it, in Joe's case, was that half of Bradley County had a story about him, and none of the stories were bad ones. Let's talk about Colin Gwaltney, because you cannot tell Joe's story without him, and because he has carried a weight in all of this that no 18-year-old should have to carry. Colin and Joe had been friends since kindergarten, not friendly. Friends, the specific and unbreakable kind that you only really make before you are old enough to be strategic about it. They grew up together, they went to school together, and they ended up at college in the same small Tennessee town. Colin was the faster runner of the two by a meaningful margin. He ran varsity cross-country at Tennessee Tech, a Division I program, which puts him in a different category of athlete than a strong recreational runner. That difference in pace would become one of the most consequential facts of the entire case, and at the time, it was nothing at all, just the ordinary arithmetic of two friends who liked to run together and had long ago worked out how to do it. The way they solved it was simple. They would start together, and then they would separate, and Colin would take a longer or harder route while Joe took a shorter or easier one, and they would time it so they finished at roughly the same moment. They had done this for years. Joe's mother described it plainly afterward, that this was simply how the two of them had always run, because Colin was faster. It was not unusual. It was not a decision anyone made that afternoon. It was a habit older than either of their driver's licenses. The third member of the group was Christian Fetzner, another friend from the same Tennessee circle. The three of them were students together, and in the summer of 2015, they did the thing that a certain kind of young American does exactly once, at exactly that age, in exactly that window between one school year and the next. They got in a car and drove west. The car was Colin's, an old Subaru with the mileage of a vehicle that has already had at least 2 lives. The plan was 15 days. They left Tennessee and went out across the middle of the country and into the desert, and they saw Las Vegas, and they saw San Francisco, and they stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon. It was a road trip in the oldest and least complicated sense of the word. 3 young men, a beat-up car, cheap food, and more country than any of them had seen before. They ran the whole way. That is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about who these two were. This was not a trip with a workout squeezed in when convenient. Joe and Colin ran together in city after city and state after state, a couple of Tennessee kids logging miles in the parking lots and side streets of the American West. The year before, the two of them had gone backpacking on the Appalachian Trail. They were comfortable outdoors. They were not casual about fitness. They were, by the standards of almost any 19-year-old you can name, careful and capable people, which is to say that when this case first hit the news, and a certain kind of commenter started to suggest that a couple of college kids had wandered off unprepared into the mountains, that was never what happened here. These were athletes on the 8th or 9th day of a long, well-run trip. The last stop on the route was Colorado. Now picture the Rainbow Trout Ranch, because the setting is not incidental to this story. It sits in Conejos County, in the far south of Colorado, close enough to the New Mexico line that the nearest town in one direction is Antonito, and the nearest in the other is Chama. The ranch occupies just under 600 acres along the Conejos River, hemmed in on both sides by the Rio Grande National Forest and bordering the South San Juan wilderness. There is no concrete. There are no power lines running through it. The elevation at the ranch house is just under 9,000 feet. At the center of the property is a lodge that was built in the early 1920s out of local Engelmann spruce, the same wood luthiers use for the tops of guitars because of how it carries sound. It runs to about 18,000 square feet, and at the time it went up, it was the largest log structure in the Southwest. The story the family tells, and it appears to be true, is that not a single nail was used in the whole building. It was assembled with wooden pegs. The roof rises 40 feet at the peak. High windows spill light down into the middle of it. There is a double-sided fireplace, a library, a trading post, and a wide porch hung with hummingbird feeders where guests sit in rocking chairs in the late afternoon while the light goes gold on the canyon wall. The property started life around the turn of the 20th century as a private fishing club, a retreat for a handful of sportsmen who had figured out how good the trout water was on that stretch of the Conejos. It opened to the public in the 1920s. For a long stretch, there was no electricity at all, and various attempts to generate some, first with a turbine in the creek and later with a diesel generator, met with mixed success right through until the early 1960s. Because of where it sits, deep in the canyon, the ranch for years had the only working telephone for miles, and neighbors would come to use it. Joe's Aunt Jane and his uncle David Van Berkom ran the place, along with David's parents Doug and Linda, who had been welcoming guests personally for decades and walking them to their cabins themselves. In the summer, the ranch employed something like 30 college students as wranglers and waiters and counselors and housekeepers. There were trail rides and hay rides and fly fishing lessons and cookouts down by the river and honest-to-goodness square dancing in the lodge. It is, by every account I have read, a genuinely lovely place. That is part of what makes this story sit so strangely. Joe Keller did not disappear from a truck stop or a highway shoulder or a bad part of a city at 2 a.m. He disappeared from a family holiday in daylight at a working guest ranch owned by his own blood relatives in one of the most beautiful canyons in Colorado. You are standing on the porch of that lodge in July of 2015. The hummingbirds are working the feeders about a foot from your shoulder, furious and weightless. Somewhere behind the building, a wrangler is calling to a horse. The river is high and loud with snowmelt, and you can hear it under everything else, the way you stop hearing a sound after about 10 minutes and then notice it again. Across the canyon, the north wall goes up in ponderosa pine until the trees run out and the bare basalt starts. And above that, there is nothing but sky. Dinner is at 6. It smells like wood smoke and hot dust and pine. That is the world Joe Keller ran out of at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 23rd of July, 2015. Let's talk about the day itself, because the timeline of that afternoon is the single most examined stretch of time in this entire case, and almost every theory anyone has ever offered lives or dies on some detail inside a window of about 90 minutes. The three of them came into Colorado at the end of a long haul. Exactly how long is one of the small, unresolved things about this case, and it is worth being honest about it rather than smoothing it over. Some accounts have the group arriving at the ranch the previous day, on the 22nd. Others, including reporting from Dateline at the time, have them pulling in on the morning of the 23rd. Joe's mother has said that the boys drove roughly 24 hours straight to get there and had not slept in more than a day. Those versions do not entirely agree with one another, and there is no way now to reconcile them perfectly. What is not in dispute is that they arrived tired at altitude from close to sea level in a single push. That matters. The ranch sits at just under 9,000 feet. Cleveland, Tennessee sits at about 800. Neither Joe nor Colin was acclimatized. Anyone who has driven up out of the flatlands and tried to exercise the same day knows the feeling. The way the air seems to have had something taken out of it. The way your heart rate sits 15 or 20 beats higher than it should for the effort you are putting in. Fit young athletes are, if anything, more prone to underestimating this than unfit people are, because they are used to their bodies doing what they are told. At some point that afternoon, Joe helped split wood with David Van Berkom's father, Doug, who was 75 years old at the time. This is a small detail, and it has stayed with his mother for years, because it is such an ordinary, decent, physically demanding thing to do at the end of a 24-hour drive. He was tired. He split wood with his great-uncle anyway. Then he decided to go for a run. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Joe and Colin came out to stretch their legs. The plan was an hour. It was a shakeout run, the kind of workout you do after too long in a car, more about moving your body than about training. They would be back for dinner. Joe left his phone at the ranch house. He left his wallet as well. He put on red running shorts and blue trail shoes and an Iron Man watch, and that was the entirety of what he took with him. He did not wear a shirt. It was warm and sunny, and he was going out for an hour on a road, and there was no version of that afternoon in which any of that seemed like a decision worth thinking about. You are standing at the ranch gate at 4:30 on a July afternoon in 2015. There is a huge old ponderosa pine at the entrance, the kind of tree that has been there long enough to be a landmark rather than scenery. The gravel of Forest Road, 250, runs past you in both directions, pale and dusty, cut through the bottom of the canyon. To your left, on the south side, there are open meadows going down to the river and cattle standing in them, not doing much of anything. To your right, on the north side, ponderosas climb the slope in ragged ranks until the ground gets too steep and rocky for them, and then the trees simply stop and the basalt begins, a wall of dark rock going up and up above the road toward the summit of Black Mountain at 11,210 feet. Two young men in running shorts jog past you. One of the wranglers, a young woman working the corral, calls out to them to pick it up. They both laugh, and Joe sprints away up the road for the sheer showing off of it before easing back into his pace. That was the last time anybody at the ranch saw Joe Keller. The canyon he ran into is, by local reckoning, one of the harder places in the world to get lost. The old-timers around Conejos say that even a blind man could find his way out of it, and they are not being flippant. It is a corridor. There is a river at the bottom, a gravel road beside the river, meadows on one side and a wall on the other. If you are in the canyon and you want to get back, you go downhill until you hit the river or the road, and then you follow it. That is the whole navigation problem. In July, at the height of the season, Forest Road 250 carries a vehicle every few minutes, campers and fishermen and ranch traffic and Forest Service trucks. It is not a wilderness route. It is a busy gravel road through a spectacular but essentially legible landscape. That fact is the reason this case became what it became. Almost everything strange about the Joe Keller disappearance flows from the collision between how simple that terrain looks and how completely he vanished into it. And it is worth understanding the county itself, because the shape of Conejos County explains a great deal about what happened next. Conejos is Spanish for rabbits. The county takes in a piece of the San Luis Valley on its eastern side, flat agricultural country where sheep graze in the sun and farmers grow potatoes and barley that get trucked north to Denver. Its western third climbs into the Rio Grande National Forest and does not come back down. The Spanish settled this valley in the 1600s, and their names are still on everything. Before them and interwoven with them were the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Kiowa. In the 1870s, the miners arrived chasing gold and silver, and by the turn of the century, the mining was largely finished, and the people who stayed went back to running cattle and growing food. The county seat area centers on Antonito, a small town on the New Mexico line that most travelers know, if they know it at all, as the southern terminus of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, a narrow-gauge steam line that hauls tourists up over a mountain pass into New Mexico on tracks laid in the 1880s. In the year Joe disappeared, Antonito had 3 new marijuana dispensaries drawing customers north across the state line, which in a town that size is a considerable economic event. There are around 8,000 people in the whole county. There is not a single traffic light in it. It is one of the poorest counties in Colorado, and it is physically larger than the state of Rhode Island. That combination is the machine that produced everything that followed. Enormous, empty, beautiful, broke. Joe Keller ran into a landscape that has fewer resources per square mile devoted to finding lost people than almost anywhere else in the country, and the reason he ran into it is that his aunt happened to live there and the fishing is very good. About a quarter of a mile in, the two of them split up. This was, again, entirely routine. Colin later described it very simply, that he took one road up and Joe did not follow, which was normal because they ran at different paces. There was no argument, no incident, no moment. Two friends of unequal speed did the thing they had been doing since they were kids. We know a fair amount about what Colin did next, because he was wearing a GPS watch, and the track from that watch survived. It shows him turning right off Forest Road 250 and onto the ranch drive, then working his way up and around behind the lodge. He was trying to get a look at 3 rock formations that stand over the ranch, 3 outcroppings that the family has long called Faith, Hope, and Charity. The tallest of them has a cross on top. The run turned into a scramble almost immediately. That is the word Colin used, and anyone who has tried to run uphill on loose, steep ground at 9,000 feet knows exactly what he meant. So he gave up on the formations, cut back down toward the road, and headed upriver instead, running west, deeper into the canyon. A fly fisherman working the Conejos about 2.5 miles up the road saw Colin go past. He did not see Joe. That single negative observation would be turned over and over again in the months that followed, and it is genuinely difficult to know what to make of it, because the fisherman was one man on one stretch of one river, and Joe could have gone by while his back was turned. Still, it is one of the few pieces of information anyone has from inside that hour. And what it says is that Joe was probably not on that section of road at that time. Colin never encountered his friend at any point. He ran until his hour was up, and he ran hard enough, at an altitude he was not ready for, that he ended up vomiting. Then he turned around and jogged back to the ranch house to wait. Have you ever wondered what the worst hour of your life would feel like if you did not know at the time that it was happening? Colin Gwaltney spent that hour standing around the lodge, catching his breath, drinking water, waiting for his friend to come around the corner so they could go clean up for dinner. An hour after he got back, he started to worry. That is a remarkably reasonable response. Runners get lost. Runners take a wrong turn and add 3 miles. Runners stop to look at something. An hour of overdue, in daylight, in a canyon you cannot really get lost in, is annoying rather than frightening. When Joe did not show up to get ready for dinner, Colin and Christian got in the car and drove up Forest Road 250, windows down, leaning on the horn, expecting at every bend to see him limping toward the road with a rolled ankle and a sheepish expression. His uncle later described the mental image everybody had that evening, that Joe would come stumbling out of the brush like a steer that had gotten separated from the herd. They drove and honked and stopped to call his name into the trees, and then drove a little further up and did it again. There was nothing. By 7:30, a small group of ranch hands had started up the rocks toward Faith, the closest of the 3 formations, on the theory that Joe had done exactly what Colin had tried to do and gotten himself stuck somewhere on the scramble. By 9:30, There were about 35 people out looking, ranch staff and guests and family, spread across the meadows and the lower slopes in the last of the light. David Van Berkom said something afterward that has stayed with almost everyone who has read about this case. He said that if Joe had been hurt, he would have heard them. 35 people were shouting his name within a couple of miles of the ranch on a still summer evening in a canyon that funnels sound, which meant, David said, that Joe was either unconscious or not there. Around 10 in the evening, the family called the Conejos County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Howard Galvez and 2 deputies arrived around midnight. By the time they pulled up to the ranch, the date had rolled over. It was now the 24th of July. It was Joe Keller's 19th birthday. What happened over those first few hours was what search and rescue professionals call a hasty search. It is exactly what it sounds like. You do not have the resources or the daylight to be systematic, so you go fast and you go to the most likely places, and you accept that you are trading thoroughness for speed because in the first day, speed is worth more. Robert Kuster, who wrote the standard reference work on lost person behavior and who was consulted on this case, has a line about the first 24 hours being the ones that matter. He pointed out something specific about Joe. Like most missing runners, he was not dressed to spend a night outside. Shorts, shoes, no shirt, no water, no light, no phone. At 9,000 feet, a July night in the San Juans can drop into the 40s. It was, as it happened, a warm night. Nobody at the ranch went to bed. Everyone still expected the story to end at dawn, with a tired, embarrassed, mildly hypothermic teenager walking down the road with a hell of a story to tell. In the morning, Jane Van Berkom called her sister. Zoe Keller was 56 and Neil was 59, and their daughter Hannah was 17 years old. From the moment they got that phone call, it took them less than 24 hours to get from Tennessee to a canyon in southern Colorado, which involved flying to Albuquerque, renting a car, and driving 3.5 hours north. They arrived at the ranch at 2 in the morning. At 6 that morning, the professional search began. The starting point was what searchers call the point last seen, which in this case was the ranch's big Ponderosa Pine Gate. A deputy fire chief from La Plata County named Roy Vreeland, who was 64, showed up with a Belgian Malinois named Cayenne. The dog worked the gate and gave a direction of travel, up Forest Road 250, heading west, upriver, the same direction Colin had gone. That should have been the break, because in most searches it is. More dogs arrived from Albuquerque. And here is where the first genuinely strange thing about this case appears, because those dogs did not agree. Some gave a different direction of travel entirely. Some gave nothing at all. Over the following days, more dogs came, and the pattern held. There was no consensus. There was no scent trail that multiple teams could confirm. Dogs are not magic, and handlers will tell you that themselves. Scent behaves in unpredictable ways in canyon terrain, pooling in low ground, riding thermals up slopes, getting scrubbed out by heat and wind and dust and the passage of vehicles. 200 searchers walking around also contaminates ground. But the total absence of agreement was, from the very beginning, a problem, because it meant that the single most useful tool for narrowing a search area was giving investigators nothing they could act on. You are standing in a gravel turnout on Forest Road 250 at 6 in the morning, 3 days in. There's frost on the hood of somebody's pickup, and the sun has not come over the canyon rim yet. So everything is that flat blue color that has no shadows in it. Somebody is handing out photocopied maps with hand-drawn grid squares on them. There is a folding table with a coffee urn and a box of donuts on it, and a woman with a clipboard writing down names and cell numbers, and 11 dogs on leads, all pointed in slightly different directions. Somewhere behind you, a horse trailer is being unloaded. Nobody is talking much. Everybody there believes at 6 in the morning on day 3 that this is the day. To be fair to everyone involved, they did not sit around waiting for the dogs to sort themselves out. In that first week, the search engaged roughly 15 dogs and 200 people, working on foot, on horseback, and on all-terrain vehicles. The Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control flew an infrared-equipped airplane over the canyon. Colin's brother Tanner set up a fundraiser online that brought in more than $16,000, most of which paid for 5 hours of helicopter time. A volunteer pilot flew his own fixed-wing aircraft up and down the canyon repeatedly. A local man named Ren Johnson, a young father who lived in the county, handed the family his personal drone and let them fly the steep embankments along Highway 17 and the rock formation called Faith with the cross on its summit. Abandoned cabins were searched, the river was searched, the pit toilets at the campgrounds were checked. Sheriff Galvez would say later that they even collected bear droppings and put them in the evidence freezer, which is the kind of detail that sounds absurd until you sit with it for a second and realize it is the sound of people running out of ideas. A reward was posted, $10,000 at first, and they came back with nothing at all. Not a shoe, not a sock, not a watch, not a shred of red fabric, not a footprint, not a smear of blood on a rock. Now, think about what should have happened. A shirtless kid in bright red shorts on foot, on a well-trafficked gravel road, in the middle of the afternoon, at the height of the summer season, within roughly a 2-mile radius of a working ranch with 30 staff. Vehicles were passing every few minutes, and there were fishermen down in the river and campers at the campgrounds and guests out on horseback along the trails. Not one person came forward to say they had seen him after he left the gate. That is the fact at the center of this case, and it is the reason that for the next 11 months, thousands of people who had never met Joe Keller would find themselves lying awake, trying to work out how it could possibly be true. Let's talk about what happened to the search, because the honest answer is that it did not so much fail as evaporate. The first week was genuinely impressive by the standards of rural Colorado. 200 people is a real search. 15 dogs is a real search. Aircraft in the air, riders in the meadows, ATVs on the forest roads, and a family with the resources and the will to keep pushing. For about 7 days, Conejos Canyon had more people in it looking for one teenager than it had probably had for any single purpose in decades. And then the thing happened that happens in every long search in a poor county, which is that the volunteers went home. They did not go home because they stopped caring. They went home because searching is unpaid, and because the people who show up for these things have jobs and children and shifts and mortgages, and because a week is an enormous amount of time to give away for free. One volunteer put it to a reporter in a way that is hard to argue with, that in Colorado you put out the call, and after a few days people start saying that if he has not been found by now, they have to get back to work. That is not cynicism, that is arithmetic, and it means that in practice, the size of a search collapses on a curve, and the curve is steepest right around the point at which a rescue quietly becomes a recovery. To be fair to the volunteers and to the agencies, that transition is one of the ugliest moments in this entire field because nobody ever announces it. There is no meeting where somebody says out loud that they no longer expect to find him alive. There's just a morning when there are 40 people at the staging area instead of 180, and then a morning when there are 12. And I want to explain something about what the word searched actually means, because I think most people picture it wrong. And the misunderstanding is the source of a lot of the strangeness people perceive in cases like this one. When you hear that an area was searched, you probably imagine something like a line of people shoulder to shoulder walking slowly across a field, missing nothing. That happens occasionally on flat open ground for very small areas with enormous numbers of people. It is not what happens on a mountainside. What happens on a mountainside is that a team of 3 or 4 people is given a segment on a map, and they walk through it in whatever way the terrain allows, which usually means following the paths of least resistance, the drainages and the game trails and the open timber, because the alternative is to spend 4 hours covering 200 yards. Search managers do not talk about whether an area was searched. They talk about probability of detection, which is a number between 0 and 1, describing the likelihood that a searcher would have found the subject if the subject was in that segment. On easy ground, with good visibility, a well-run team might achieve something like a 50% probability of detection on a single pass. In heavy timber, in boulder fields, on steep talus, it drops enormously, which is why segments get searched 2 and 3 and 4 times, and why a segment can be marked as covered and still be hiding a person. Now apply that to the specific ground where Joe was found, a boulder field at the base of a cliff, where the rocks are the size of vehicles and stacked at angles with black voids between them, on a slope steep enough that horses could not be brought up and dog handlers could not safely work. Aerial infrared is close to useless in that terrain after the first day, because a body cools to ambient temperature and because rock holds the day's heat and radiates it back all night, and because you cannot see through a boulder anyway. So when people ask how hundreds of searchers missed a body less than 2 miles from the ranch, the honest answer is that the searchers were mostly not up there, and that the small number of people who did go up there were looking at ground where a probability of detection of 1 in 10 would be generous. That is not a scandal. It is physics and manpower. But it is why the phrase previously searched area carries far less weight than it sounds like it should, and why it should not, on its own, make anybody reach for a stranger explanation. Into that shrinking space came the other thing that always arrives, which is noise. You have to understand what an information vacuum does to a case like this. There was, effectively, no evidence, no last sighting, no physical trace, no scene, no vehicle, no phone data, because the phone was sitting in the ranch house the whole time. When there is nothing, people will build something, and they will build it out of whatever is at hand. A tourist came forward with a time-stamped receipt from a small gift shop in Hawker, a tiny settlement down the road, and said she had seen 2 men on the road that afternoon. That is exactly the kind of lead investigators live for. because a receipt anchors a person to a place and a minute. She later changed her account. That happens more often than people realize, and it is usually not dishonesty so much as the ordinary unreliability of memory under pressure. But it meant the one apparently solid civilian sighting in the file dissolved. A psychic reached out through the family's Facebook page to report a vision that Joe was west of Sedona, Arizona, about 600 miles away. The family passed it along. They were criticized for that afterward, and I think that criticism is deeply unfair. When you have nothing, you will look at anything, and the administrators of that page said as much at the time, that they were desperate for any positive development at all. And then there were the theories that grew out of the internet rather than out of the canyon. That Joe had been abducted, that he had been taken for his organs and sold on some black market, that he had staged the whole thing and started a new life somewhere, that he had been killed by the people he was traveling with. Robert Kerster, the lost person behavior researcher, was blunt about this in a way that I think is worth keeping in mind for the whole of the rest of this story. He described himself as a scientist and said he was fond of Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually the right one. You could, he said, construct a scenario in which a band of terrorists tied a young man to a tree and interrogated him. He asked whether such a thing was possible, and answered that, of course, it was. Then he asked whether it was likely, and answered that it was not. The trouble is that Occam's razor is very hard to hold on to when the simple explanation requires you to believe that hundreds of people walked past a body for 11 months. Let's talk about Colin and Christian, because they were put through something they did not deserve. When a young man disappears and the last people to see him are his two closest friends, suspicion is inevitable. And a certain corner of the internet went at those two boys with real cruelty. So it is worth stating this plainly and clearly, and stating it more than once. Both of them volunteered to take polygraph examinations. Both of them passed easily. The Bradley County Sheriff in Tennessee, Eric Watson, whose office reviewed their phones, said that the texts and voicemails showed no hint of any dispute of any kind between the three of them. Neither young man was ever charged with anything, was ever named a suspect by any agency, or was ever the subject of any finding of wrongdoing whatsoever. They were two exhausted teenagers who had lost their friend, and they spent the following year being accused of murder by strangers on the internet while helping to search the canyon he was lost in. Colin was out there in May of the following year, on his hands and knees in the brush, still looking. By the second week of August, the FBI had been consulted. That is not the same as the FBI taking over a case, but it does indicate that the possibility of foul play was being taken seriously rather than dismissed. Two deputies from Bradley County in Tennessee eventually traveled to Colorado to work the case from the Tennessee side, a lieutenant named Brian Quinn and a detective sergeant named Kevin Chastain. It is worth noting that Bradley County had offered to send a full response team early on, and that Conejos County initially declined the offer, which did not go down well in Tennessee, and which became one of the enduring sore points of the whole affair. On the 4th of August 2015, 13 days after Joe went missing, Sheriff Galvez suspended the official search. The river had already been searched and ruled out, and it was dropping fast as the snowmelt tapered off. The dog teams had produced nothing usable. The cabins had been searched twice. The sheriff's position was that they had exhausted the resources available to them and had uncovered no information suggesting that continuing to search at that moment would accomplish anything. Now, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make Howard Galvez the villain of this story, and I do not think that is honest. Here is what his situation actually looked like. He had been elected sheriff 9 months earlier. He had years of law enforcement experience, but no background whatsoever in leading search and rescue operations, which is a genuinely specialized discipline with its own mathematics and its own literature. His department had 5 deputies. The starting salary for those deputies was $27,000 a year. Conejos County is one of the poorest counties in Colorado. It is physically larger than the state of Rhode Island. It has around 8,000 residents and not a single stoplight, and roughly a third of it is national forest. Galvez said afterward, with what sounds to me like real weariness rather than defensiveness, that he did not think he should be in charge of search and rescue on federal land at all, and that he was considering going to state legislators to ask to be relieved of it, because he did not have a $90 million budget. He also said of the resources that had been thrown at the canyon that they had so much it was unreal. Both of those things can be true. It can be true that Conejos County mounted the largest search it had ever attempted, and true that the search was not remotely adequate to the problem, because friction had set in almost immediately. One responder said that by the time he arrived on the second day of searching, tension between Neil Keller and the sheriff was already rising. Keller felt that Galvez was not doing enough. Galvez felt that Keller was in the way, giving orders and criticizing his people. By October, the two of them were no longer speaking to each other at all. Neil Keller's position, stated calmly to a reporter later, was that the average response for a lost person runs about 5 days, and that there needs to be a plan for applying resources for longer than that. That is not an unreasonable thing for a father to say. It is, in fact, more or less exactly what the professionals in this field say too. The family raised the reward from $10,000 to $25,000, and then to $50,000. They hired 2 private investigators at $800 a day. Zoe Keller called it a waste of money afterward. One of the investigators told a reporter that he had never worked a case with less to go on. Joe's uncle David summarized the entire situation in 7 words, that there just was not a sniff of anything. Which brings us to the bloodhound. About 2 weeks after Joe vanished, an undersheriff from neighboring Alamosa County named Sean Woods, who had been called in to assist by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, mentioned to Neil Keller that he knew a tracker. The man's name was Alan Duffy. He was 71 years old, and he worked as a surgical assistant, and he had come to bloodhounds in the most terrible way possible, which was that his own brother David had disappeared in the northern Sierra Nevada in 1978 at the age of 21. David was found 6 weeks later, dead of gunshot wounds. Duffy had spent the decades since running dogs, including taking them through John Bennett Ramsey's neighborhood and tracking stolen horses across Wyoming. On the 15th of August, Duffy loaded a 3-year-old bloodhound named R.C. into his Jeep and drove 300 miles from Broomfield down to the Rainbow Trout Ranch. A deputy handed him a scent article, one of Joe's used sock liners, which Duffy considered about as good as it gets. Duffy will tell you that bloodhounds have gone out of fashion. They drool, they pass gas, they are susceptible to disease, they do not live long, and you can never let one off the lead under any circumstances, because a bloodhound on a scent has stopped being a member of your household and become a natural process. Everybody, he says, wants a shepherd now, but he makes a case for the old way, which is that when you are actually lost, the animal that is going to find you is not going to be a shepherd. R.C. worked for 4 hours in his orange harness, which is his signal that he is looking for a living person. Then Duffy switched him to the black collar, which is the cue for cadaver work. 4.5 miles up Forest Road 250, at a shallow, murky pond called Spectacle Lake, the dog circled. He pulled at the vegetation on the bank. He bit at the water. Then he walked into the shallows and sat down in them and would not leave. Duffy, to his credit, did not overclaim. He was not convinced there was a body in that pond. He explained that scent gets drawn toward water and that rain or animals could have carried material from somewhere else into the drainage in quantities far too small for a person to notice and far too large for a bloodhound to ignore. What he believed was that there were human remains somewhere in that area. The problem was that 4.5 miles from the point last seen was already at the outer edge of what the probability model said was plausible for a runner on foot, and the pond itself became an idea that could not be tested. Diving it properly required equipment and money the county did not have. Duffy offered other scenarios as well, and some of them landed badly. At one point he told the family that R.C. had picked up human remains scent under buildings on the ranch itself. You can imagine what that did to Jane and David Van Berkom, who had opened their home to their nephew and were now being told, in their own yard, that a dog was alerting under their floors. Zoe Keller was gentler about Duffy than almost anyone would have been. She said that at least he was trying, and that he could have been right. That is what desperation looks like at the 10-week mark, not hysteria. Just a mother extending grace to a man with a dog because he was the only person still showing up. In October, Neil Keller flew back to Colorado and stood in front of the Conejos County commissioners and asked them publicly for more help. He wanted a dive team for Spectacle Lake. He described himself as the father of a missing boy, his only son, and said he would like as much in the way of resources as could possibly be made available. He was by then not on speaking terms with the sheriff whose county he was asking. He had lost 15 pounds from hiking and scrambling at altitude. Just before Thanksgiving, he and David Van Berkom and a small group spent 2 days working the snow-covered scree west of the ranch, on the reasoning that it was the area least likely to have been covered properly because it was the meanest ground. They found nothing. Then winter closed the canyon, and the road belonged to snowmobiles and coyotes, and Neil Keller went home to Tennessee to wait out a Colorado winter without knowing where his son was. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that is bigger than Joe Keller, because it is the reason his case ended up in a national magazine. Have you ever wondered who is actually responsible for finding you if you disappear on federal land? The intuitive answer is that the federal government is. Stand in a national forest and you naturally assume that you are, in some sense, inside a system. The land is federal. It is mapped, patrolled, signed, permitted, and managed. If you go missing in it, surely the agency that manages it comes looking. That is not how it works, and the reality is stranger and shabbier than almost anyone expects. With the exception of New Mexico and Alaska, in most western states, the responsibility for searching for a missing person falls to the county sheriff, under statutes that in some cases date back to the frontier era when the sheriff was the only organized government within 100 miles. It does not matter that the land is federal. It does not matter that the county has 5 deputies and no budget. If you vanish in a national forest, you are a local problem. There are no federal standards for terrestrial search and rescue. Very few states have standards of their own, which means, as Robert Coaster puts it, that there is an enormous spectrum of capability, and where you happen to fall on that spectrum is decided entirely by which county line you were standing inside of when things went wrong. The Rio Grande National Forest covers 1.8 million acres across parts of 9 counties. It has 1 full-time law enforcement officer. 1. The Conejos Peak Ranger District alone, where Joe disappeared, covers roughly 377,000 acres, and the district ranger at the time, Andrea Jones, said something that ought to be more widely known than it is. She said that there were occasions when her office first learned about a search and rescue operation in the forest from the local media, and that when that happens, it is difficult for them to properly engage or offer the knowledge and resources they have. Read that again. The people who know the ground best sometimes found out from the weekly newspaper. It gets worse when you look for numbers. The National Institute of Justice, the research arm of the Department of Justice, has described unidentified remains and missing persons in this country as the nation's silent mass disaster, and estimates that on any given day somewhere between 80 and 90,000 people are actively listed with law enforcement as missing. The overwhelming majority of those disappear in populated places, but nobody knows, even approximately, how many are missing on the roughly 640 million acres of federal land in the United States, because nobody counts. There is a Department of Justice database, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. Reporting into it is voluntary in all but a handful of states, and participation by law enforcement and coroners is voluntary too. So a substantial share of the missing are also missing from the database of the missing. After the September 11th attacks, the Department of the Interior tried to build its own system to track law enforcement incidents across the lands managed by the Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, and Indian Affairs. The Forest Service, incidentally, is not even in that group because it sits under the Department of Agriculture instead. The resulting system cost around $50 million, and in the year Joe Keller disappeared, only about 14% of the reportable incidents were ever entered into it. Fish and Wildlife declined to use it at all, which is to say that the United States government can tell you with reasonable precision how many grizzly bears and gray wolves are on its land, and cannot tell you how many people are. On the 4th of February 2016, Neil Keller drove to Denver for a ceremony at the state capitol. Legislators were passing resolutions creating the first annual Colorado Missing Persons Day. Families of the missing stood together in the building while the names were read out. Joe's name was one of 300. That spring, the canyon opened up again, and 2 things happened almost at once. In April, 2 men from Antonito were reported overdue from a camping trip to Duck Lake. less than 3 miles southwest of the Rainbow Trout Ranch, during a spring storm that dropped 2 feet of wet snow. Teams came in from Mineral and Archuleta counties, along with the ski patrol from Wolf Creek, 100 miles away. One of the men managed to struggle out on his own and reach Hawker. The ski patrol found the other one frozen. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it happened 3 miles from the ranch in country that had been crawling with searchers 8 months earlier, and it demonstrates as clearly as anything could that this landscape kills people who are not doing anything reckless. And in May, the search for Joe restarted properly for the first time since the previous summer. More than 30 volunteers came, including Neil Keller and Colin Gwaltney, along with 11 dogs from a non-profit called Colorado Forensic Canines. They spent about a week crisscrossing Conejos Canyon. The stated goal was not really to find Joe. It was the more sober and more useful objective of significantly reducing the probability that he was anywhere inside a radius of just under 3 miles from the point last seen. The whole effort was organized by the John Francis Foundation, a small Minnesota non-profit that has helped more than 40 families with loved ones missing on public land. It exists because of a man named David Francis, a retired Naval Reserve captain, whose 24-year-old son John disappeared in Custer County, Idaho in 2006. John's body was found the following year in a deep ravine, not by an agency, but by professional mountain guides the family paid out of pocket. David Francis has a line about this that cuts right to the bone. He points out that Custer County is roughly the size of Connecticut, and that its search and rescue budget was $5,000. If you go missing in a poor county, he says, you are going to get a short and somewhat sloppy search, and in his view, that is the national disgrace. Everybody knows somebody with cancer. Almost nobody knows somebody who is missing. The May search turned up no sign of Joe Keller. It did turn up something else. Bushwhacking off the Duck Lake Trail, about 3.5 miles southwest of the ranch, Neil Keller and Colin Gwaltney came across a sleeping bag, a cook pot, a tarp, and a can of bug spray. It was the gear of the 2 lost campers from April. Think about that. The father and the best friend of a missing young man, out looking for him for the 10th or 11th time, found the belongings of somebody else's tragedy instead. And they were, at that moment, roughly 2 miles from Joe. Let's talk about the theories, because for 11 months, this case belonged to whoever wanted to explain it, and the explanations ranged from the entirely reasonable to the frankly unhinged. I want to go through them properly, one at a time, with what supports them and what does not, because I think this is the part of the story where it is easiest to be unfair to somebody. Start with the one that dominated the first 6 weeks, which is that somebody took him. This theory had a real advocate in Colin Gwaltney, who believed early on that foul play was involved and that somebody in a truck may have picked Joe up for reasons nobody could guess at. Neil Keller came to believe something similar, telling a reporter months later that the family felt Joe was not in that area at all, that he had been taken from it. And you can see exactly why they got there. It is the only theory that explains the total absence of a trace. If a person is in a canyon, a person leaves signs. If a person is in a vehicle, they do not. But look at what the abduction theory requires. It requires a stranger on a gravel forest road in broad daylight in the busiest month of the year to take a fit and muscular 18-year-old male athlete against his will quickly and quietly enough that nobody saw or heard it, and then to leave no vehicle description, no witness, no physical evidence, and no subsequent trace of any kind anywhere in the country for the rest of time. Vehicles were going up and down that road every couple of minutes. There were fishermen in the river. There were guests on the trails. There is also no motive on offer. Joe Keller had no enemies that anybody could identify. He had no debts. He had no involvement with drugs or alcohol of any kind. He was a stranger in that county who had arrived hours earlier and knew nobody outside his own family. The idea that he stumbled onto something illegal in the middle of a national forest was floated, and it is not impossible. But it asks you to believe in a remarkable coincidence of timing on the one afternoon he was there. And to be fair to the people who believed it, they were not being irrational. In the absence of a body, abduction was the theory that fit the observed facts best. It was simply the wrong theory, and it took until the following July for anyone to know that. Now, the second theory, and this one is harder to talk about, because it was voiced by the sheriff himself. Late in the case, Howard Galvez told a journalist that this was an ongoing missing person investigation with no evidence of anything else, that Joe was just missing, and that it looked more like that than anything. He added that once you are over 18, you can run away all you want, and that if Joe were to call and show some proof that he was all right, the sheriff would close the file. I understand why he said it. From a law enforcement standpoint, an adult with no evidence of foul play is legally free to walk away from his life, and a great many missing adults have done exactly that. But it landed on that family like a stone, because it is very close to saying that a boy who volunteered at the Salvation Army and coached children to swim had abandoned his parents and his sister without a word, without money, without identification, without a phone, without shoes he could walk any distance in, and without ever contacting anyone again. The evidence against it is comprehensive. He left his wallet. He left his phone, which was examined and showed nothing. He was registered for his second year of college. He had a car full of his belongings at his aunt's house. There was no indication of depression or crisis on his devices or in his messages, and the people who knew him best, including a best friend of 14 years, rejected it completely. And of course, in the end, he was found less than 2 miles from where he started, which is to say the runaway theory was never really a theory, it was a jurisdictional position. The third possibility is water, and it deserves serious treatment because for a while it was the leading professional hypothesis. The Conejos River in late July is still carrying snowmelt. It is cold, fast in places, and undercut in others. A runner who slipped down the bank, hit his head, and went into that water could plausibly disappear for a long time, and rivers are notorious for holding bodies and then releasing them somewhere unexpected, weeks later. The river was searched repeatedly, and it was dropping fast, and searchers ruled it out. Then Alan Duffy's bloodhound sat down in Spectacle Lake 4.5 miles upstream and refused to move, and the water theory came roaring back. The counter-argument was always the distance, 4.5 miles up the road, on foot, on an hour-long shakeout run, at altitude, when you have already turned around to be back by dinner, is a long way. Not impossible for an athlete, but at the far edge of the probability curve, and the probability curve is the only tool searchers really have. Duffy himself, again to his credit, said the alert did not mean a body was in the pond. Scent moves toward water. Runoff carries material. A dog that good will find a trace of something that a person could stand in the middle of and never detect. What his alert most likely meant in hindsight was nothing more than that Conejos Canyon is a place where dead things end up in the drainage, which is true of every canyon in the American West. The fourth explanation is the medical one, and this is where the case starts to come into focus. Joe Keller arrived in the San Juan Mountains after a very long drive from close to sea level with little or no sleep, and went out to exercise the same day at 9,000 feet. Before that, he had split firewood. He carried no water. He was, in the language of altitude medicine, about as poorly set up as a healthy young athlete can be. Now, nobody is suggesting he collapsed with high-altitude cerebral edema on an hour-long jog at 9,000 feet. That is not how that works, and it would be dishonest to imply otherwise. What altitude does to an unacclimatized person in the first day is subtler and much more common. It produces headache, nausea, breathlessness out of proportion to effort, and critically, it degrades judgment. Add dehydration, add sleep deprivation measured in the tens of hours, add the specific psychology of a competitive young athlete who has just been dropped by a faster friend and is running alone in the most spectacular landscape he has ever seen. Colin, remember, vomited on that same run. He was the fitter of the two, and he still ended up sick from the altitude. Whatever the mountain was doing to Colin, it was very likely doing more of it to Joe. Have you ever wondered how many wilderness deaths begin not with a catastrophe, but with a slightly worse decision than the person would have made on a normal day? Which brings us to the fifth explanation, the one that the professionals kept quietly returning to from the very first week, and that almost nobody outside the search community wanted to hear. Robert Kuster made the point early. It would not have been at all unusual, he said, for a young athlete like Joe to switch from running mode into scrambling mode. Heading for higher ground is a well-documented strategy in lost person behavior, because you go up to see where you are. And based on his age, Kuster added, it might simply have been a fun thing to do. There are two facts that sit alongside that, and together they are almost persuasive enough to end the argument on their own. The first is that Joe's mother remembered him talking about the rock formations, faith, hope, and charity, standing over the ranch, the tallest, with a cross on the summit. He had mentioned them. He wanted to see them. The second is that Colin Gwaltney, on that same run, in that same hour, did exactly that. His GPS track shows him turning off the road, going up behind the lodge, and attempting to reach those outcroppings before the ground got too steep and he gave up and came back down. Two young men, on the same afternoon, in the same canyon, both drawn to the same high ground. One of them turned around. Have you ever wondered why nobody acted on that at the time? I think the answer is that everybody, including the professionals, was searching for a runner. That sounds obvious, and it is actually the whole problem. A runner is a category with a behavior profile attached to it. Runners stay on surfaces you can run on. Runners follow roads and trails and river corridors. Runners who get into trouble are usually found within a predictable band of distance along a linear feature, because that is what running is. So the search was built, sensibly and correctly by the book, around the road, the river, the campgrounds, the trails, and the meadows. It was a linear search of a linear landscape. But Joe Keller had stopped being a runner at some point that afternoon. The moment he put a hand on rock, he became a completely different search problem, with a different behavior profile, a different distance curve, and a different set of places to look. Kirster said as much in the first days, that it would not be unusual for a young athlete to switch from run mode into scramble mode, and that going up is a documented thing lost people do. That warning was in the record from the beginning. It just never reorganized the search, and I do not entirely blame anyone for that, because reorganizing a search around the cliffs would have meant sending volunteers with no technical training onto steep, loose rock, which is how searchers get killed. There were also, at any given moment, only so many people. Neil Keller understood it eventually, and he understood it the hard way. His sentence about the canyon is the summary of everything the search got wrong, and he arrived at it by walking the ground himself for a year. It is not the meadow on top, it is the cliff. The other thing worth saying about the scramble explanation is how ordinary it is. There is a version of this in which Joe Keller does something reckless and pays for it, and that version is not true, and it is not fair. Climbing up a few 100 feet of broken rock to get a view is something that happens 10,000 times a day in the American West, mostly by people with no equipment and no training, and almost all of them come back down and never think about it again. It is not a warning sign. It is a Thursday. He was a strong 19-year-old at the end of a long drive in the most beautiful place he had ever been on the day before his birthday, and he went to look at a rock formation he had been curious about. That is not a mistake. That is just what happened. Now, let's talk about the theory that made this case famous on the internet, because it is the reason a lot of you have heard of Joe Keller at all, and because I want to handle it honestly rather than just mocking it. There is a body of work called Missing 411, assembled by a former San Jose police officer named David Paulides. Paulides originally ran an organization dedicated to searching for Bigfoot, and his attention shifted to missing persons after what he describes as an encounter with two off-duty rangers who told him something strange was going on with the numbers of people disappearing in national parks. In 2011, he founded the Can-Am Missing Project, which catalogues wilderness disappearances he considers unexplained, and he has published a long series of books on the subject. Paulides is careful, at least in interviews, not to state a theory outright. What he does instead is list recurring characteristics: dogs unable to track scents, late afternoon as an unusually common time to vanish, victims found with clothing or footwear removed, bodies discovered in areas that had already been searched, sometimes right beside a trail, people, particularly children, found impossible distances from where they were last seen, in terrain they should not have been able to cross. Look at Joe Keller's case against that list. The dogs disagreed and produced nothing usable. He vanished in the late afternoon. His body was found in terrain that had been searched, or at least searched around, for the better part of a year. And it was found in ground that a great many people considered improbable for a runner. You can see why the case became a fixture in that world. It ticks the boxes. But I think it is worth being straight about why those boxes exist, and the answer is not mysterious. Late afternoon is when people are furthest from where they started and most tired, so it is when they get into trouble. Dogs fail in dry, hot, windy, contaminated canyon terrain all the time, and handlers say so openly. Bodies are found in searched areas because searching is far less thorough than laypeople imagine, And because a searcher walking a hillside covers a strip of ground a few yards wide and calls it a grid, clothing removal has a well-documented physiological explanation in hypothermia, and people in trouble travel further and into worse ground than seems reasonable, because being lost makes you do that. John Billman, the journalist who spent the most time on this case, put it about as fairly as anyone could. He said it was tempting to dismiss Paulides as a crank, and that some search and rescue professionals do, but that the books are extensively researched. Both halves of that sentence are doing work. What I would say is this: the missing 411 framing filled a vacuum that the government created. If federal agencies could tell you how many people go missing on public land and where and what happened to them, there would be far less oxygen for the idea that something inexplicable is happening out there. The reason people reach for the strange explanation is that the ordinary explanation is not being provided by anyone with the authority to provide it. That is not a failure of the public. That is a failure of record keeping. And there is one more thing about the anomalous framing that I think matters. And it is not a scientific argument. It is a human one. Every one of these cases belongs to a family. When a case gets pulled into a genre, the family loses control of the story. Their son stops being a 19-year-old who wanted to teach math and becomes a data point in somebody's cluster map. I do not think the people who follow these cases mean any harm at all. I think most of them are decent and genuinely curious. But it is worth remembering, when a case becomes a phenomenon, that somewhere there is a mother who has to read all of it. So where did that leave things by the summer of 2016? The professionals believed Joe had gone up. The family believed he had been taken. The internet believed something stranger. And the canyon, which had been searched by 200 people, 15 dogs, 2 aircraft, a helicopter, a drone, and a bloodhound that had already found things nobody else could, had given up absolutely nothing in 11 months. The one thing everybody agreed on was that the searching was essentially finished. There was no more money, no more official interest, and no more ideas. And then a man who had nothing to do with any of it decided to go and have a look. His name was John Reinstra. He was 54 years old. He was an endurance runner and a search and rescue hobbyist. And before that, he had been an offensive lineman in the National Football League, playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had no official role in the Keller case. Nobody sent him. On Wednesday, the 6th of July, 2016, he drove up Conejos Canyon and went looking. What he did next is worth walking through slowly, because it is a small masterclass in thinking about a problem instead of grinding at it. Reinstra knew, because it had been widely reported, that searchers had concentrated their effort along roughly the first 2.5 miles of road above the ranch. So he did not start there. He started by asking what in that stretch could actually kill a healthy young man. Not get him lost, kill him. He went looking for rapids, for caves, and above all for cliffs, on the reasoning that in a canyon you can walk out of, the only thing that will end you quickly is gravity or water. Right at the 2.5 mile mark, he found a place where you can pull a vehicle off the road and close by, cliffs. It took him about an hour to climb up to the base of that cliff band. When he got there, he turned left and worked along the bottom of the wall until he simply ran out of room and could go no further. Then he turned around and came back the other way, toward the ranch, still following the base of the cliffs. And that is where Joe Keller was. He was lying in a boulder field below a wall of rock that has been estimated at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 feet high, in ground so broken and so steep that horses could not be brought in and dog teams could not work it. When the Colorado Bureau of Investigation came to recover him, they packed horses up as far as the animals could go, and then they walked the rest. He was 1.7 miles from the ranch as the crow flies. 1.7 miles. 200 searchers had walked that canyon along with 15 dogs, an aircraft carrying infrared, a helicopter for 5 hours, and a drone. 11 months and 13 days had gone by since he jogged past the corral, and he was less than 2 miles from the porch of the lodge, above the road that half of them had driven up and down 100 times. Now, I want to be careful with how I say this next part, because it would be very easy to turn it into an accusation, and I do not think an accusation is warranted. The area where Joe was found had been searched, at least in the general sense, the year before. In November of 2015, Neil Keller and David Van Berkom had come within several hundred yards of him, several hundred yards, in a canyon. Neil Keller said afterward that he regretted not searching there on the 25th of July in the first days, and that it was where he wished he had started. And then he said the thing that I think is the truest sentence anybody has said about this case. He asked what part of that landscape would take a life, and answered his own question. It is not the meadow on top. It is the cliff. Jane Van Berkom wrote something later that is almost unbearable to read. She pointed out gently and correctly that hindsight is always perfect, and that with a blanket of snow on the ground, she was not sure they would have found him, even if they had gone higher that November. And then she said that she had sat on those cliffs many times in the months he was missing, scanning the ground below over and over. She never saw him. She said that it tortures her. Every day, she said, she and her husband had searched for Joe as part of their ordinary ranch routine, riding out, working stock, looking, always looking, at their own land. You are on the north side of Conejos Canyon in the summer. The ground under you is scree and talus, loose plates of dark volcanic rock that shift and clatter when you put weight on them. Above you, the wall goes up out of sight. Below you, through gaps in the pines, you can see the pale line of the gravel road and a flash of the river. And if the wind drops, you can hear a truck going by. There are boulders down here the size of small cars, stacked and tilted against one another, with black gaps between them. A body in this could be 6 feet from you and invisible. And the country goes on like this, unbroken, for miles in both directions. That is what searchers were up against. Not a mystery, a geometry problem, with the wrong number of people trying to solve it. The remains were sent to the El Paso County Coroner's Office for identification. Because of the condition they were in, the family knew before anyone official confirmed it. They recognized his clothing and his description. On the 11th of July, the page they had been running for almost a year posted that although it had not been officially confirmed, they knew Joe had been found, and they thanked everyone for 11 difficult months of prayers and concern. DNA confirmation came back in the first week of August 2016. The family posted it simply, saying that the results had confirmed the remains found on the 6th of July in Conejos Canyon were indeed Joe, and asking people to keep the Kellers in their prayers as they prepared to bring him home. Let's talk about what the coroner found because it matters, and because it is the point where this case stops being a mystery for most people and does not stop being one for everybody. The Conejos County coroner, Richard Martin, determined that Joe Keller died of a skull fracture sustained in a fall from a cliff. The death was ruled an accident. Jane Van Berkom said he had also suffered a broken ankle. The preliminary finding relayed at the time was blunt force trauma to the head. The reconstruction that came out of the coroner's office was that Joe had attempted to climb the cliff, made it roughly halfway up, and fallen backwards onto the rocks below, striking his head. If that is what happened, then everything about this case snaps into place at once. A tired athlete on a shakeout run at unfamiliar altitude turns off the road to go look at the high ground he had been talking about, the same high ground his friend had tried for that same hour. He climbs. He is a strong young man with no fear and no rope and no experience with rock. Somewhere around halfway up, he gets onto something loose, or he reaches for something that is not there, and he goes over backwards. Death would have been very fast. He almost certainly never knew he was in serious trouble until he was already falling. And then he lay in a boulder field, screened by rock in terrain nobody could bring a dog into, for 349 days. Occam's razor, as Robert Kuster said, turned out not to be as dull as it had seemed. But I said this case does not stop being a mystery for everybody, and it does not, because Joe's mother has never accepted it. And I think her objections deserve to be laid out properly rather than waved away. Zoe Keller's position is not that somebody murdered her son. It is narrower and more careful than that. What she says is that the events do not fit for an hour-long run before dinner, after the boys had just driven roughly 24 hours straight to get to the ranch and had not slept in more than a day. She says her son did not like heights. She says he was not a climber. She has said, plainly, that there's something they still do not know about what happened. Take those in turn because they are not foolish objections. The timing genuinely is odd. This was a shakeout jog with a dinner deadline. Turning a 1-hour recovery run into a technical scramble up several hundred feet of loose rock is not a small deviation from the plan. It is a completely different afternoon. The heights point is harder to assess because we are talking about how a mother understood her son, and mothers are usually right about that and occasionally not. Plenty of people who dislike exposure will still scramble up something with their hands, especially at 19, especially alone, especially with something at the top they have been curious about. But it is also true that people generally do not change their fundamental relationship with heights on a Thursday afternoon, and the exhaustion point cuts both ways, which is the thing I keep coming back to. Zoe raises it as evidence that the reconstruction cannot be right, that a boy that tired would not have gone climbing. But sleep deprivation, altitude, and dehydration are precisely the conditions under which people make decisions that their rested selves would not make. The very fact she offers as an objection is, to a lost person behavior researcher, part of the explanation. What none of that changes is that a man walked to the base of a cliff and found her son at the bottom of it, with a fractured skull and a broken ankle in a boulder field, and that no evidence of any other person's involvement was ever found by any agency in either state. The case file was closed, the manner of death was accident, and a family from Bradley County, Tennessee, brought their son home after 349 days. Let's talk about what was left behind, because a case like this does not end when the file closes. Start with Cleveland, Tennessee, which behaved during that year about as well as a town can behave. Signs with Joe's information went up all over Bradley County and stayed up. A woman named Tammy McConnell organized a prayer rally for the family and said something to a local reporter that gets at exactly why the town took it so hard. She had 4 children around his age. 2 of them knew him. In a place that size, everybody was 1 degree removed. You were driving through Cleveland, Tennessee in the autumn of 2015. It is a Friday and the high school is playing at home. There is a flyer taped inside the window of a gas station, curling a little at the corners from the heat of the glass, with a photograph of a blonde kid squinting into the sun. There is another one in the window of a diner 2 blocks down, and another at the church, and another at the hardware store. And by the time you have driven across town, you have seen his face 9 or 10 times without ever once looking for it. His parents built the page that became the clearinghouse for the entire case and later a website, and they carried the reward up to $50,000 out of their own resolve. They did every interview anybody asked for. They flew back and forth across the country for a year. Neil Keller spent so much time hiking and scrambling at 9,000 feet that he lost 15 pounds doing it. That is what a search looks like when the institution stops and the family does not. And then, about 9 months after Joe came home, his story went national in a way nobody in that family would have chosen. In April of 2017, Outside Magazine published a long feature by a journalist named John Billman, built around Joe's disappearance, that asked a question almost nobody had asked in print before. How many people are missing on America's public lands? And who is actually responsible for looking for them? Billman later expanded that reporting into a book called The Cold Vanish, published in 2020, which followed the disappearance of a young cyclist named Jacob Gray in Olympic National Park, and used it as a spine for the whole strange world that assembles itself around a missing person. Search and rescue professionals, volunteer trackers, bloodhound handlers, psychics, Bigfoot researchers, and grieving fathers who quit their jobs and moved into trucks. Joe Keller is the case that opens that inquiry. His name is the reason a lot of people learned that the federal government does not count the people who go missing on federal land, because that was the finding and it has not meaningfully changed since. There is a woman named Heidi Streetman, an affiliate faculty member at Regis University in Denver, who teaches research methods and who became so frustrated by the absence of any searchable resource for families of the disappeared that she started a petition asking the Department of the Interior to be held accountable for people missing in national parks and forests. It gathered thousands of signatures. It did not change federal policy. There is a retired Michigan State Police detective named Michael Niger, who now specializes in backcountry search and recovery, and who wants something quite modest, which is for volunteers like himself to be able to see the same information the agencies have. Case profiles, topographic maps, dog track data, and weather records. The material you would need to actually think about a problem instead of walking around hoping. There was one real legislative improvement, and it is worth naming because it came from exactly this frustration. An amendment to existing law, known as the Good Samaritan Search and Recovery Act, made it substantially easier for qualified volunteer search organizations to get access to federal land. The old obstacle was permit approval and liability insurance, which could take weeks. Under the change, qualified volunteers can search within 48 hours of filing paperwork. That is a genuine improvement. It is also, set against the scale of the problem, very small. Colorado Missing Persons Day, the ceremony Neil Keller attended in February of 2016, with 300 names on the list, has continued as an annual event. Joe's case was part of the pressure that helped create it. And it is worth pointing out what happened in the same valley, in the same window, to make the contrast clear. About 100 miles north of Conejos Canyon in Saguache County, a man named Mike Rust had gone missing in March of 2009. Rust was 56, and he was one of the genuine pioneers of American mountain biking, a frame builder and racer whose innovations are still in the sport. He came home one evening, found that his house had been broken into, called a friend to say he was following the tracks and was never seen again. In January of 2016, 6 months into the Keller search, an anonymous tip led Saguache County deputies and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to excavate a hole on private property. They found human remains. In April, DNA confirmed they were Mike Rust. In June, an arrest warrant was issued for a man named Charles Gonzalez. In December of 2017, a Saguache County jury convicted him of first-degree murder, burglary, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Same valley, same years, and the same shortage of resources. 2 men who went out into ordinary country and did not come back. One died in a fall from a cliff and it took 11 months to find him. The other was murdered and buried and it took nearly 7 years, and it only broke because somebody talked, which tells you something important about wilderness disappearances, that both the sensational version and the official version tend to flatten. Sometimes the strange thing is a fall. Sometimes it is a crime. The reason people cannot tell the difference from the outside is that the searching in both cases is thin enough that the outcome depends on luck, and a great many of them are still out there. Dale Steeling walked away from a petroglyph viewing trail at Mesa Verde National Park on a 100-degree Sunday in June of 2013, a short distance from the gift shop, and has never been found. Morgan Heimer, a 22-year-old professional rafting guide wearing a Sirius flotation device, disappeared in the Grand Canyon in 2015. Chris Fowler vanished from the Pacific Crest Trail in the autumn of 2016. Jacob Gray left his bicycle by a road in Olympic National Park in April of 2017 and walked into the trees. Each of those is a family in the same position the Kellers were in for 11 months. Some of them have been in it for a decade or more. As for Conejos County, Howard Galvez said openly that he did not believe a sheriff with 5 deputies should be responsible for search and rescue across 1/3 of a million acres of federal forest, and that he was considering asking the state to relieve him of it. That responsibility has not moved. The structure that produced this search is, in its essentials, still the structure. The Rainbow Trout Ranch is still there. The Van Berkhams still run it. Guests still arrive in late May and leave in late September, and the hummingbirds still work the feeders on the porch of a lodge built out of spruce and wooden pegs a century ago, and the north wall of the canyon still goes up into the sky above the road. There is a cliff up there that most of them will never notice. So where does the case of Joe Keller stand today? It stands closed. The Conejos County coroner determined that Joe died of a skull fracture from a fall, and ruled the manner of death accidental. No person was ever charged with any offense connected to his death, and no agency in Colorado or Tennessee ever developed evidence that any other person was involved. Colin Gwaltney and Christian Fetzner, who were suspected by strangers on the internet and by nobody with a badge, were never named as suspects, passed polygraph examinations voluntarily, and were entirely cleared. His mother continues to believe there is something about that afternoon that we still do not know, and she has never been offered anything that would settle it. Because behind the case file, and underneath the theories and the cluster maps and the 11 months of speculation, was a real person. A 19-year-old from a small town in eastern Tennessee who wanted to teach high school mathematics, someone who spent his Saturday mornings at the Salvation Army when he could have been asleep, someone who stood on a wet pool deck teaching frightened children to put their faces in the water, and who had the patience for it, someone whose closest friend had been his closest friend since they were 5 years old, and who had spent the previous summer with that friend on the Appalachian Trail, carrying everything he needed on his back, someone who beat childhood asthma and then spent the rest of his short life running, swimming, and dragging himself through mud pits under barbed wire because he liked how it felt to be strong. Someone who, at the end of a 24-hour drive across the country, went and split firewood with a 75-year-old man because it needed doing, and he deserved better than 349 days at the bottom of a cliff, less than 2 miles from a house full of people who loved him. So tonight, as you think about Joe Keller's story, maybe remember him not for how he died, but for how he lived. For the 23rd of July, 2015, at 4:30 in the afternoon, when a wrangler at a corral called out to 2 young men to pick it up, and one of them laughed and sprinted away up a dusty road just to show off, with the whole canyon gold in the late light and his birthday the next day and everything still in front of him. There is a thing that cases like this teach if we let them, and it is not about the wilderness being sinister. The country he ran into was not sinister. It was beautiful and indifferent, the way all of it is. What this case is really about is how thin the net is, how much of what we assume is a system turns out, when you actually need it, to be a handful of volunteers with day jobs, a sheriff with 5 deputies, and a family with a credit card, and how much of the difference between a body found in 11 days and a body found in 11 months comes down to nothing more than which county you were standing in. There is a reason his father's sentence about that canyon has stayed with me. What part of here would take a life? Not the meadow on top, the cliff. Somebody eventually went and looked at the cliff. It took a stranger 11 months and about an hour of walking. Joe Keller was found. That is more than most of the people in this story can say, and his family knows it, and they have said so. He came home to Tennessee. He is not one of the ones still out there, but he should have come home in July